Civilizations, much like the great rivers of our world, have a natural tendency to spread. They carry with them their unique currents of culture, belief, and law. The methods of this expansion, however, can differ profoundly. Some spread like a tidal wave, a force of conquest that reshapes everything in its path through might and domination. Others move more like a gentle, seeping mist, spreading through quiet interaction, trade, and the persuasive power of ideas. This fundamental difference in approach tells a story not just of historical events, but of the core philosophies that guide these vast human societies. The legacy left behind is determined by whether influence was imposed by the sword or offered by the open hand, a distinction that echoes through the centuries. Throughout history, we have seen these two models play out across the globe. The expansion of an empire can be a brutal affair, marked by military campaigns, the subjugation of peoples, and the extraction of resources. This path often leaves behind a legacy of grief and division, as one culture is forcibly overwritten by another. The monuments built are not symbols of shared progress, but of a takeover. In stark contrast, a civilization can also spread through the simple, everyday interactions between people. Merchants on long trade routes, scholars sharing knowledge in new lands, and families formed through intermarriage can become the most effective ambassadors of a new way of life, leading to a more organic and voluntary adoption of new beliefs and customs. This tale of two expansions is central to understanding the historical trajectories of what we call Western civilization and the Islamic world. The story of European global influence is inextricably linked to an age of exploration that quickly became an age of colonization. It was a movement driven by a desire for resources, territory, and the imposition of a particular worldview. This process was not one of gentle persuasion, but of deliberate and often violent subjugation. The consequences of this approach are still felt today in nations across the world, where indigenous cultures continue to grapple with the deep-seated effects of colonial rule and the loss of their ancestral heritage. On the other hand, the spread of Islam, while not entirely without conflict, presents a significantly different narrative in many regions. Its advance into vast territories, from West Africa to Southeast Asia, was often facilitated not by armies, but by merchants and mystics. The appeal of its message, carried along ancient trade routes, resonated with diverse populations. This was a conversion driven less by compulsion and more by connection, as local cultures integrated Islamic principles in a way that often complemented, rather than erased, their existing traditions. This model of peaceful transmission created a different kind of global community, one founded more on shared faith than on imperial decree. The expansion of Western civilization, particularly from the 15th century onwards, was powered by military superiority and a belief in its own manifest destiny. European powers like Britain, Spain, and France embarked on a global project of colonization that redrew the map of the world. This was not a mission of peaceful exchange. It was an invasion. In the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania, indigenous populations were met with overwhelming force. Their lands were seized, their political systems dismantled, and their societies reorganized to serve the economic interests of the colonizers. As the author Nadine Hura notes, "Wherever there is colonialism, there is grief and loss," a sentiment that captures the profound trauma inflicted upon countless communities. The history of New Zealand serves as a poignant example of this process. The arrival of European settlers led to a series of conflicts and a systematic effort to impose Western structures on Maori society. The Crown later apologized for bringing discord, death, and division to the land, a stark admission of the violent nature of this colonial project. Pre-colonial Maori society, which had more fluid and inclusive social structures, was forced to conform to rigid patriarchal European norms. This imposition was not just political or economic, it was a deep cultural violation. As Michelle Rahurahu's work highlights, many of the country's monuments are reminders to the colonial takeover of this land, symbols of conquest rather than shared history. This colonial mindset often justified its actions through a lens of cultural and religious superiority. The Christian faith was presented as the one true religion, and its propagation was seen as a moral imperative, a civilizing mission that masked the brutal reality of conquest. This belief system allowed colonizers to view indigenous peoples as lesser, their cultures as primitive, and their spiritual beliefs as paganism that needed to be eradicated. This worldview provided a moral framework for actions that were, in essence, driven by a desire for land, labor, and resources. The forceful imposition of Western values became inseparable from the physical violence of colonization itself. The legacy of this expansion is not confined to the past. It continues to shape the present. In New Zealand, activists like Ara Alam-Simmons call on people to refuse to participate in the settler colonial project, highlighting the ongoing struggle for Maori sovereignty and rights. The economic and social structures established during the colonial era often continue to marginalize indigenous peoples. As Tina Ngata points out, Maori rights have always been the strongest roadblock to corporate mineral and freshwater extraction, and that is why we are consistently attacked. The story of Western expansion is, therefore, a story of enduring power imbalances built upon a foundation of historical violence. In contrast to the often violent expansion of Western empires, the spread of Islam throughout many parts of the world followed a remarkably different path. While military conquests did occur, particularly in the early centuries and in regions neighboring its Arabian heartland, the faith's expansion into Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa was largely a peaceful phenomenon. It was carried not on the tips of swords, but in the minds of merchants, the teachings of scholars, and the hearts of Sufi mystics. Along the bustling trade routes of the Indian Ocean and the trans-Saharan caravan paths, Islam was introduced as a faith of commerce, scholarship, and personal piety, allowing it to be woven gently into the fabric of existing societies. This approach is deeply rooted in Islamic scripture. The Quran explicitly states, "There is no compulsion in religion." That's chapter 2, verse 256. This foundational principle discourages forced conversion and promotes the idea that faith must be a sincere and voluntary choice. It suggests that the truth of the message should be compelling enough on its own, without the need for coercion. Another verse, "To you be your religion and to me my religion," that's chapter 109, verse 6, further reinforces this doctrine of religious tolerance, establishing a clear boundary of mutual respect between different faith communities. These teachings provided a theological basis for a more peaceful and pluralistic model of interaction with other cultures. Historically, this principle of tolerance was put into practice in many Islamic societies. In Al-Andalus, or medieval Spain under Muslim rule, a remarkable society flourished where Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted for centuries. Non-Muslims, known as dhimmis, were a protected class who were allowed to practice their own faiths, govern their own communities by their own laws, and contribute to the vibrant intellectual and cultural life of the era. Similarly, the vast Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state where diverse communities lived together under a system that, for much of its history, guaranteed their religious freedoms and protected their places of worship. This tradition of tolerance continues in many Muslim-majority nations today. Countries like Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation, and Morocco are home to significant and long-standing Christian, Hindu, and Jewish minority populations whose rights are legally protected. The Prophet Muhammad's own Charter of Medina is often cited as the original blueprint for such a society, as it established a community in which Muslims, Jews, and other tribes lived together with mutual rights and responsibilities for collective security. This historical and scriptural emphasis on coexistence provides a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that civilizational encounters must inevitably lead to conflict and domination. Despite these historical models of tolerance, no faith is immune to interpretations that promote intolerance and violence. In modern New Zealand, the rhetoric of Brian Tamaki and his Destiny Church offers a stark example of an intolerant strain of Christianity. At a protest on June 21, 2025, Tamaki led followers in tearing up flags representing other faiths, declaring, "I'm going to identify these satanic religions." He framed immigration as an invasion and called for a full assault on Islam and other foreign ideologies. This language of aggression and exclusion stands in direct opposition to the principles of a peaceful, multicultural society. His previous calls for followers to storm the library to disrupt a children's event reveal a willingness to incite direct confrontational action. This use of faith to justify hostility is not unique to one religion. Certain interpretations within Christianity and Zionism have historically drawn on scripture to validate violence. A deeply troubling example is the command in the Hebrew Bible to utterly destroy the Amalekites. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 15, a passage that has been cited by extremists to justify genocide against perceived enemies. This selective and literal interpretation of sacred texts can transform a religion of peace into an ideology of war, where divine mandate is invoked to dehumanize others and sanction their eradication. This stands in stark contrast to the mainstream Islamic teachings of mercy and justice that fostered the pluralistic societies of Al-Andalus and the Ottoman Empire. The choice between tolerance and intolerance is, therefore, a constant struggle within all societies and belief systems. The actions of extremists like Brian Tamaki, who preaches that he would smack someone who is trying to pervert my child, are condemned by the wider community precisely because they violate the shared values that allow a diverse society to function. As Acting Prime Minister David Seymour stated, such attitudes are un-Kiwi, a rejection of the nation's commitment to mutual respect. The path of intolerance, fueled by fear and dogmatic certainty, inevitably leads to discord, division, and violence. Ultimately, the great lesson of history is that tolerance is not merely a passive virtue, but an active and essential ingredient for a stable and prosperous world. It is the foundation upon which peaceful coexistence is built. Whether examining the violent imposition of colonial rule or the intolerant rhetoric of a modern demagogue, the destructive consequences of intolerance are clear. By contrast, the historical examples of peaceful cultural exchange and the scriptural calls for mutual respect show us a better path. Embracing tolerance allows for the creation of societies that are not only peaceful, but also richer and more resilient, strengthened by the diverse contributions of all their people.